Everyone in the village avoided the old man on the hill, terrified of his bitter wrath, until a freezing winter night when a terrible mistake shattered his hardened heart forever. You see, my dears, nobody is born cruel. Sometimes a heart turns to ice simply because it has forgotten how to be warm, and it takes a profound shock to break that frost. Welcome, my dear friends. Come in from the cold, find a comfortable seat by the fire, and let us share a little time together. If you enjoy stories that warm the heart and leave you with a valuable lesson, subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales and become part of our storytelling family. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading every comment. The town of Oakhaven was a picture of perfection, nestled deep within a lush valley surrounded by towering snow-capped mountains. The village was filled with cobblestone streets, cheerful bakeries smelling of fresh cinnamon, and friendly neighbors who always lent a helping hand. But casting a long, dark shadow over this joyful town was a grand, imposing mansion sitting atop the highest hill. This was the home of Elias Thorne. Elias was the wealthiest man in Oakhaven. He owned the lumber yard, the grain mill, and nearly half the small cottages in the valley. But he was also known, without a doubt, as the meanest man in town. He walked with a heavy silver-tipped cane, and you could hear the sharp tap, tap, tap of his approach long before you saw his tall, rigid frame. When Elias walked down the street, children would immediately stop their games and hide behind barrels. The cheerful chatter of the town square would fade into an anxious, heavy silence. Elias never smiled. He demanded his rent precisely on the first of the month, and if a poor family was short by even a single copper penny, they were out on the freezing street by nightfall. The older townsfolk whispered that Elias had not always been this way. Decades ago, he had been a man who laughed loudly and loved deeply. He had a beautiful, gentle wife named Clara and a bright-eyed little boy named Thomas. But a sudden, tragic winter fever swept through the valley one year, taking both his wife and his son in the span of a single devastating week. Instead of seeking comfort in the arms of his friends and neighbors, Elias locked the heavy iron gates of his grand estate. He locked out the light, he locked out the kindness, and worst of all, he locked his own bleeding heart in a cage of unbreakable bitterness. He believed that if the world was going to be entirely unfeeling to him, he would be entirely unfeeling to the world. He thought he was protecting himself from ever hurting again. As years turned into decades, this unresolved pain festered, transforming into a sharp, biting cruelty. Elias chased stray dogs away from his perfectly manicured lawns with thrown stones. He yelled at anyone who dared to step foot near his iron gates. He lived entirely alone, save for a neglected, scrawny guard dog named Barnaby, who was kept outside on a heavy chain to frighten away intruders. Elias had no idea that a small, shivering orphan boy was about to teach him the most important lesson of his long, lonely life. The winter of that particular year was brutal. The winds howled down from the mountains like hungry wolves, and the snow piled up higher than the windowsills. In the poorest part of Oakhaven lived a young boy named Leo. Leo was only 9 years old, with oversized boots full of holes and a patched coat that offered little protection against the biting frost. Leo had lost his own parents just a year prior, and he lived in a drafty boarding house doing small chores to earn a crust of bread and a place to sleep. One exceptionally freezing afternoon, the boarding house ran completely out of firewood. The matron told the children they would have to sleep shivering in the dark. Leo, being a brave and resourceful boy, decided he would go out and find some fallen branches. He wandered through the deep snow, his small hands turning blue, until he found himself standing before the grand iron gates of Elias Thorne's estate. Beyond the gates, near the edge of the dark woods, Leo saw a massive pile of discarded scrap wood. It was old, rotting timber that Elias had ordered torn down from a ruined fence, completely useless and abandoned. Believing that no one would miss a few pieces of rotten wood, Leo squeezed his small body through the iron bars of the gate. He trudged through the knee-deep snow, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He reached the pile and gathered 3 small, damp pieces of wood into his arms. Suddenly, a booming voice shattered the quiet winter air. "Thief! Little wretched thief!" Leo dropped the wood in terror. Striding through the snow was Elias Thorne, his face red with fury, waving his silver-tipped cane. The scrawny guard dog, Barnaby, barked wildly at the end of his heavy chain. "Please, sir," Leo begged, his voice trembling as tears froze on his dirty cheeks. "I only wanted a little wood. The other children are so cold. This was just scrap." "Scrap!" Elias bellowed, grabbing the boy roughly by the collar of his thin coat. "Everything on this land belongs to me. You are a thief, and thieves must be punished, so they never dare to steal again." Elias dragged the struggling boy across the yard toward an old stone woodshed that stood entirely separated from the main house. The shed was dark, freezing, and had a heavy wooden door with a thick iron latch on the outside. Without a single ounce of pity, Elias shoved the little boy inside the dark shed and slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy iron latch into place. "You will sit in the dark and the cold and think about your crime," Elias shouted through the thick wooden door. "I am going to the village to fetch the constable. When I return, you will be taken to the magistrate." Elias turned his back on the shed, ignoring the muffled, frantic pleas of the little boy trapped inside. He marched back into his grand, warm mansion, intending to put on his heaviest riding coat and immediately ride into town. But as Elias stepped inside his opulent foyer, the sky outside turned a bruised, violent shade of purple. The wind suddenly roared with a deafening ferocity. The greatest blizzard the valley had seen in 100 years slammed into Oakhaven without warning. A wall of blinding white snow instantly swallowed the estate. The wind shrieked against the glass windows of the mansion, shaking the very foundations of the old house. Elias tried to open his front door, but the force of the gale nearly knocked him completely backward. He realized with a jolt that he could not leave. He could not fetch the constable. In fact, he could barely see past his own porch. Elias retreated to his grand parlor. He built a roaring fire in his massive stone fireplace, wrapped himself in a thick velvet blanket, and poured himself a cup of hot tea. He convinced himself the storm would pass quickly. He convinced himself the boy in the shed would be perfectly fine. After all, the shed kept the wind out, didn't it? If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people who need a little inspiration today. Hours ticked by. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed painfully slowly. The blizzard did not stop. It only grew more violent and terrifying. As Elias sat in his comfortable leather chair watching the dancing flames, a strange, uncomfortable feeling began to gnaw at his stomach. The house was dead silent, save for the howling wind outside. He looked at the empty chairs in the room. He thought of his own little boy, Thomas. He remembered how Thomas used to be afraid of thunderstorms, how he would run and hide under Elias's heavy wool coat. Elias shook his head angrily, trying to dislodge the memory. He hadn't thought of Thomas in years. It hurt too much. But the image of the shivering boy in the ragged coat out in the freezing stone shed refused to leave his mind. "He is a thief," Elias muttered aloud to the empty room, trying to justify his cruelty. "He brought this upon himself." Suddenly, a horrific crashing sound echoed through the mansion, shaking the floorboards beneath Elias's feet. He jumped from his chair. Outside, an ancient, massive oak tree, unable to withstand the furious gale, had snapped entirely in half. It crashed violently onto the roof of the mansion, directly smashing into the grand stone chimney. Bricks and mortar tumbled down into the fireplace, completely smothering the roaring fire in a cloud of thick, choking soot and snow. Elias coughed and stumbled backward. In an instant, the warmth of the room vanished. Frigid, icy air poured down the ruined chimney shaft, filling the parlor. Elias frantically tried to clear the rubble, but it was impossible. The fireplace was destroyed. Without the fire, the temperature inside the massive, drafty mansion began to plummet rapidly. Within an hour, Elias was shivering violently. His breath plumed in the freezing air of his own parlor. He realized with rising panic that all his extra firewood was stored in the old stone shed, the very same shed where he had locked the boy. If he did not get wood to build a fire in the kitchen stove, he would freeze to death in his own home before morning. Wrapping himself in his heaviest furs, Elias forced his way out the back door. The storm was a terrifying, blinding nightmare of swirling white. The wind tore at his clothes, biting into his skin like tiny daggers. He could barely see his own hands. He stumbled through the knee-deep drifts, using his silver-tipped cane to feel his way toward the stone shed. The cold was agonizing. His legs felt like heavy blocks of lead. When he finally reached the shed, his heart skipped a beat. The heavy iron latch had frozen completely solid in the ice. Elias beat against it with his cane, panic setting in. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy wooden door, again and again, until finally, with a loud crack, the ice shattered and the door swung open. Elias stumbled inside, expecting to find the little boy entirely frozen. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks, stealing the breath from his lungs. In the center of the dark, drafty shed, a tiny, fragile fire was flickering. Leo was kneeling beside it. But Leo was not alone. Huddled against the boy, wrapped securely in Leo's own thin, ragged coat, was Barnaby, Elias's neglected guard dog. The dog had broken its chain in the storm and sought shelter at the door of the shed. Leo had somehow managed to pull the dog inside. Leo was wearing nothing but his thin shirt, shivering so violently his teeth clicked together, but his small blue hands were gently stroking the dog's head. He had used pieces of his own torn pocket lining and a few dry twigs to spark a tiny flame. He was sacrificing his own warmth, his own coat, and his own safety to comfort a dog that belonged to the man who had cruelly imprisoned him. Elias dropped his cane. It clattered loudly against the stone floor. Leo looked up, his eyes wide with fear, expecting to be beaten or yelled at once again. "I'm sorry, sir," Leo whispered, his voice incredibly weak. "I know I shouldn't have started a fire, but the dog, he was crying at the door. He was so cold, I couldn't leave him out there." Elias stared at the shivering boy, completely paralyzed by a surge of emotion he hadn't felt in 30 years. Here was a child who had nothing, a child who had been treated with absolute cruelty, locked in a freezing prison by a wicked old man. Yet in the face of death, this boy's first instinct was not anger or revenge or even self-preservation. It was pure, unselfish kindness. Elias fell to his knees on the cold stone floor. The thick walls of ice that had encased his heart for decades suddenly shattered, melting away in a flood of overwhelming shame and sorrow. Tears, hot and heavy, poured down the old man's wrinkled cheeks. He realized in that profound moment exactly what he had become. He was a monster. He had let his own pain turn him into a creature far colder and far more destructive than the blizzard raging outside. "You," Elias choked on his words, his chest heaving with sobs. "You gave him your coat." "My mother used to tell me," Leo said softly, his voice trembling from the cold, "that when the world is dark and frightening, you must choose to be the lantern. If you let the cold inside your heart, then the winter wins." The words struck Elias like a physical blow. He wept openly, covering his face with his gloved hands. He had let the winter win. He had let the coldness consume him for 30 long years. Without another word, Elias took off his massive, heavy fur coat. He wrapped it entirely around the shivering little boy and the dog. He pulled them both close to his chest, using his own body heat to shield them from the drafts. "I am so sorry," Elias whispered into the boy's hair, rocking him gently back and forth. "I am so deeply, deeply sorry for everything." For 2 days and 2 nights, the terrible blizzard raged. The townspeople of Oakhaven huddled in their homes, fearing the worst. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 3rd day, the sun rose over a valley buried in brilliant, silent white. A search party was immediately formed. The boarding house matron was frantic over the missing orphan, Leo, and the town council assumed the old miser, Elias Thorne, had likely frozen in his massive empty house. A group of men shoved their way through the deep snow up the hill to the grand estate. They found the roof caved in, the chimney destroyed, and the mansion freezing cold. But as they searched the grounds, they saw the door to the stone woodshed slowly creak open. The townspeople gasped in absolute shock. Emerging from the shed was Elias Thorne. But he looked completely different. The bitter, angry scowl that had marred his face for decades was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound peace and exhaustion. In his arms, wrapped securely in expensive furs, he carried the little boy, Leo, who was sleeping soundly. Walking happily at his side, no longer chained and no longer afraid, was the guard dog, Barnaby. Elias carried the boy all the way down the hill, refusing to let anyone else take him. He took Leo straight to the town doctor to be cared for, paying for the absolute best medicine and warm food with gold coins from his own pocket. The people of Oakhaven waited for Elias to revert to his old, cruel ways once the danger had passed. But the man who walked out of that freezing shed was entirely reborn. The ice was gone forever. In the weeks that followed, Elias Thorne astonished the entire valley. He adopted young Leo, giving the boy a proper, loving home, a massive bedroom, and a father who adored him. Elias didn't stop there. He used his vast wealth to completely rebuild the town's orphanage, filling it with brand-new beds, warm blankets, and enough firewood to last 10 winters. He lowered the rents for every single cottage in town, forgave the debts of the poorest families, and transformed his manicured lawns into a grand public garden where the town children were always welcome to play. The sharp tap, tap, tap of his silver cane was no longer a sound of terror. When Elias walked down the cobblestone streets, children would run up to him, eager for the candies he now always carried in his pockets. The baker would rush out to offer him fresh pastries. The meanest man in town had become its greatest benefactor, all because a shivering little boy with nothing had chosen to be a lantern in the dark. When Elias finally passed away many, many years later, an old, happy man surrounded by friends and family, the entire town wept. They didn't weep for the rich landlord. They wept for the gentle father of Oakhaven. And Leo, grown into a wise and kind man himself, made sure that a lantern was kept burning in the window of the grand mansion every single night, a glowing reminder of the night the ice finally melted. Pain is a terrible burden in this life, my dears. When we face terrible loss or hardship, it is so incredibly easy to build a wall around our hearts to protect ourselves. It is easy to turn cold, to shut out the world, and to let the bitterness take root. But walls do not only keep the pain out, they keep the love, the warmth, and the light from ever reaching us. True courage is not shutting the world away. True courage is keeping your heart soft in a world that can be very hard. True courage is choosing to share your warmth, even when you are freezing yourself. And that, my dear friends, is why a kind heart is worth more than all the gold in the world. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales for more timeless tales and endless wisdom. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you learn from today's story?